Hi everyone, my name is Oishi and I work with CMNCP. Welcome to CMNCP22, the annual conference of Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention. I'm joining you from Hamilton, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. Thank you all for joining us for this challenges and crime prevention through environmental design. I won't be reading out the full bio of our moderator and panelists. However, I do encourage you to look at our website where we have the full biographies written there and to learn more about our amazing presenters. And so without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our moderator for this session, Elisabeth Miller. Elisabeth is an urban planner for the city of Saskatoon with a specialty in urban safety. Thank you for agreeing to take part in this session, and I'll hand it over to you to start our conversation.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here with this group of presenters. They have been or are either my mentors or my colleagues in this good work that we do, and I'm proud to have them here and to hear their knowledge on this issue of social challenges and crime prevention through environmental design. As Oishi said, my name is Elisabeth Miller. I'm a planner with the city of Saskatoon. I've been working with crime prevention through environmental design and safe growth probably since 1996. We've done a number of classes in Saskatoon as well, and we incorporate it in a number of ways, which is on our website. I won't belabor that point. This session will explore how crime prevention through environmental design can address social issues such as houselessness, substance abuse, those types of things. We'll be looking at the history of CPTED and how it's changed over time, how it can benefit the community, and what kind of collaboration occurs based on the three different presenters that we've got that are actually from sort of three fairly different areas of practice. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first presenter, which is Greg Saville. And Greg founded the Denver-based Alternation Consulting, which is a firm that specializes in first and second generation CPTED and safe growth. He's a former Canadian police officer and urban planner, and he has a degree in urban geography and a master's in planning and environmental criminology. He's a co-founder and inaugural chairperson of the International CPTED Association, which some of you may have heard of. He leads workshops and training across the globe. I think he's probably worked in just about every country. He's also the author of many articles and books, one which is the Safe Growth, Building Neighborhoods of Safety and Livability. And with that, welcome, Greg, and I will turn the floor over to you. I'm going to turn off my camera just so that it doesn't interfere with your presentation.
Thank you, Elisabeth. And I'm hoping my connection is decent here. I'm not sure that it is. I'm actually on the road today doing some work in a community. And if there's some problems with my connection, Elizabeth, please turn your camera on, just wave at me so I know that I'm not just rambling on. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much. My job is to set the context or set the stage for our speakers that follow. And I'm going to talk about three things. The first thing I want to talk about is kind of like the overall history of how CPTED got started, what were the ideas behind it. The second is particularly CPTED Canada, and the second is first and second generation CPTED. How does CPTED actually work? And then third, I'll talk about the latest sort of version on this, the latest movement to expand this model called Safe Growth. So those are the three things I want to talk about. Okay, well, what is CPTED? How to get started? Well, CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, is an attempt to do crime prevention by looking at the physical environment and where crime opportunities are created in the physical environment, and modify the physical environment in such a way that it can reduce and mitigate the opportunities for crime. That's the generic sort of description. But in actual fact, CPTED began a long time ago. It began with a book by Jane Jacobs, who's a journalist in New York, named The Death and Life of Great American Cities in 1961. And what Jane was interested in looking at was neighborhoods, neighborhoods that were safe, neighborhoods that were not safe, and how do you make neighborhoods that are safe? And she talked about things like the street ballet and how people can work together to make their places safe. And that was the whole thrust of what started the idea. She planted the first seed. She was the one who grew the first tree that turned into the branches that we call CPTED today. Most CPTED owes their existence to Jane Jacobs' work. Some writers will say it goes back to the medieval ages and forts and fortresses, but that denies the truth that those were not democratic societies. We have a democratic society, and it's quite different when you do it in this kind of a place. Following Jane Jacobs, there was a lot of studies and research by different authors. Sloman Gel was a planner studying in Berkeley under Christopher Alexander. He wrote a doctoral thesis on downtown neighborhoods using crime prevention design. Oscar Newman was an architect from Montreal who moved to New York City and was studying how you can do this kind of an idea in public housing, and ended up writing a book in 1972 called Defensible Space. And then, of course, Professor C. Ray Jeffrey was a criminologist, and he wrote the first book titled Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design in 1971. I worked with C. Ray for many years. I taught at Florida State University on faculty, and so he was a friend of mine. We talked about how the original ideas were started and so forth. And then there were studies by the Westinghouse Corporation in the 70s about looking at 3 different communities and what works and what doesn't work. And they were all focused on how you get social programs and how you get folks to work together and how you redesign areas. Something called motive reinforcement was one of the early ideas in CPTED. So that's how it got started. In Canada, the idea came north in 1975 at a University of Toronto workshop attended by a number of scholars, including Gwyn Nettler, who's a professor from the University of Alberta, who really looked at how CPTED might apply in Canada. He was concerned that there wasn't a lot of research at the time, and there wasn't. There is now, but there wasn't then. And then there was a series of papers written by parts of the government, Solicitor General, and by the RCMP. There was one author in the late 80s, the name of Sergeant Moffat, who created a very famous diagram. But the diagram was interesting because motive reinforcement and social components of it vanished from that diagram, and he inserted something called target hardening, which is from technical security, had nothing to do with what CPTED was originally about. But that's kind of how it got started. By the late, I think it's 1982, the RCMP had a course in Vancouver with Professor Pat Branningham from Simon Fraser University, first course in Canada on CPTED. In 1985, I was a police officer in Peel Region, and we were given plans to look at using crime prevention design. And Halton Regional Police in Ontario, they were doing a bit of this. So it was just trickling into the mindset of Canadian policy and Canadian policing at that time. My exposure to it was in my undergraduate program, where I read Defensible Space in 1978, and I read Jane Jacobs later on. So that's how I came to it. And then throughout the 80s, there was a whole series of experiments with it and tests on the model, how does it work and so forth. And some of the shift in CPTED started to move away from the social programming toward target hardening and technical security. There's controversies about how that happened and why that happened. But the gist of it was that by the 1990s, there was a whole bunch of people doing a whole bunch of forms of CPTED, and nothing was sort of bringing it together. So myself, Paul Wong, who was a consultant from Vancouver, Barry Davidson, who's a security consultant from Calgary, Canada, got together and decided to hold a conference. And at the conference in 1996 in Calgary, we had 70 people from around the world. We had Stan and Sherry Carter from Florida. We had Tim Pascoe, architect researcher from the UK. I had left Peel Police at that time, and Tom McKay, who was a police officer with Peel, he was doing early CPTED in Peel Region. He came to the conference, and a bunch of us. And the result of that was the formation of the world's first international CPTED professional association. That is currently called the International CPTED Association, or the ICA. And the ICA has been around for 25 years, and it has hundreds of members in dozens of countries. And it is a non-affiliated, nonprofit, professional organization of dozens of different professions, people who really get behind the advancement and the progression and the development of CPTED, both technically, theoretically, and professionally. So it has a certification program, world's first certification program. It has a course accreditation program. It has all those kinds of things. So that's kind of how it started in Canada. I can tell you that In addition to the early movement in CPTED, one of the first things we saw was there was a problem with the way CPTED was being implemented, very target hardening oriented, locks and lights and fences. So what we did was, as a result of work by Jerry Cleveland, who was a school teacher and a principal in Toronto, and some of the work I was doing in a community called Santa Romanaway in Toronto, you'll hear about that through Anna Brassard in a minute, we decided that CPTED needed to go back to its original roots, needed to reinvent the social programming, because a lot of CPTED instructors were saying, if you do good CPTED first generation, you automatically do second generation, which is nonsense, of course. That's not how it happens at all. So we actually created something called second generation CPTED in 1997, and that has to do with revisiting the social motive reinforcement ideas, how you get people to work together, how you get community building into the CPTED model. And so second generation CPTED was really started in 1997. And from that point forward, it started to be studied and researched. And there's a fair bit of documented literature now on how you actually do it. So that's CPTED in Canada. And second point is CPTED. What is first, second generation CPTED? Well, I've already alluded to first generation CPTED. Strategies that try to change the physical environment by using, reinforcing territory and using lighting, and using different types of access controls into certain areas, and getting people to take some ownership over an area, what Oscar Newman called defensible space. That's kind of what first generation CPTED did. And second generation CPTED referred back to C. Ray Jeffrey, who started CPTED basically, and he was all about integrating different approaches, integrating biology, integrating psychology, integrating urban planning, and this integrative approach to crime prevention theory. So that's what we did in second generation CPTED, and we have continued that in our recent publications in the last 3 or 4 years with Matea Mihinyac, who's the executive director of the International CPTED Association, also doing her doctorate in CPTED. And we have created something called third generation CPTED, which is kind of like the next generation of that. And we won't go into too much detail on that, other than to say that it has to do with the research in neurobiology and the research in trauma with young children and so forth. So CPTED is really coming full circle now with the different approaches to what it means. And it's really based on what C. Ray Jeffrey talked about, what his original ideas of integrative theory were about. So I don't know what more I can say about that, other than to say that we've done a number of, we've delivered this in many different communities across Canada, from places like North Battleford to Ottawa. We were there a couple of years back and delivered this kind of programming, and Calgary and so forth. So you'll hear about a lot of, and also in Saskatoon, where Elisabeth is from. So that's kind of how CPTED started. One of our concerns with first generation CPTED is, if you do target hardening, if you do the hardcore approach to it, you end up really not solving the root causes of the problem. You end up hacking at the branches. And that's really not a great way to go about tackling this problem. This happened recently in Sudbury. I'm from Sudbury. I was born there. I grew up there before I worked in Toronto. And Sudbury has used a lot of first generation CPTED on downtown disorder problems. But what the newspapers have just reported this in the news there in the last couple of months, talking about the increase in crime in the surrounding communities. So it's a classic case of displacement. So we have to be mindful of that. Second generation CPTED is certainly a way to tackle that. And that leads to my third point, which is Safe Growth. And Safe Growth is a neighborhood planning program that we developed a number of years ago to help residents learn how to do CPTED, learn how to do their own safety plans in their own communities. And CPTED is a way to avoid the target hardening and the hostile architecture that a lot of folks are attacking CPTED with nowadays. And because it's not a criminology program or crime prevention, it's actually a neighborhood building program. And so there is a diagram that Anna will show you a bit later when she talks about her case study. And the diagram is of a tree. And you'll see in the tree that the tree has branches and leaves at the top and roots at the bottom. And what you discover with a lot of crime prevention is it hacks at the branches, but it really doesn't dig at the roots. And so first generation and second generation and third generation are kind of like that. Safe Growth is actually a root, it attacks building of the roots. That's what it tries to do. That's its whole approach. We do things with the community and by the community, not to and for. That's our goal in any event. It requires a plan, specific plan in different neighborhoods. Elisabeth has a lot of these in place in Saskatoon. She can describe that to you. It requires a thorough diagnosis. We teach how to diagnose problems, how to use crime analysis, use crime mapping. We have digital apps we have for that purpose. Residents can do that. And mostly it requires collaboration with residents and people who actually do it. It's a whole new way to organize and plan cities. It does use CPTED, but only in partnership with residents, and it doesn't just use CPTED. So safe growth is kind of like the grandfather approach to a lot of this neighborhood building that we tried to do at early CPTED. We sort of got off the tracks in the 80s and 90s, and I think we'll come back to do that. So the International CPTED Association, Anna and Elisabeth are members. There's a Canadian chapter called PCAM, which Anna will tell you about if she gets into that. And I'll leave it at that and turn it over to my colleagues. That's kind of like the introduction to the concept. So Elisabeth, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Greg. It's always good to have a reminder of where we've come from and how we got there, so that we can clearly see where we want to go, not repeating mistakes that we may have made, although we don't make any.
I like to think so, anyway.
But I think it's a good idea to have that look back and to look at it with an eye to a bit of a critique and how we can do things a little bit better. And I think that is a good example of that is moving from the first generation to the second generation, when some of those critiques started coming out around the first generation being a little bit discriminatory, for lack of a better term. So thank you for that. That seats very well into Anna's presentation. So we'll hear from Anna Brassard now. Anna is an independent planning and CPTED consultant, and she's located in Calgary, so just next door from me. She's a full member of the Canadian Institute of Planners and a member of the International CPTED Association. And she's also on the board of directors of the new ICA Canada chapter, which is CPTED PCAM Canada. The PCAM is the French version. I'll let her talk about that. She specializes in CPTED and safe growth, a program which includes CPTED in a more holistic way, as Greg had just described. And her master's thesis was the first academic work worldwide on second generation CPTED. She has designed and delivered courses on community development and safety, and also facilitates workshops across North America on safe growth. And she's offered these to both police, design professionals, and community members. And good to see you again, Anna. It's not been that long, but it's a little colder than the last time we met. And with that, Anna, I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Elisabeth. I'm thrilled to be here sharing the stage with my illustrious colleagues that I just saw a couple weeks ago in the balmy Palm Springs. Okay, so what I'm going to share with you today is, first of all, I'm going to share my screen. This is what Greg was talking about in terms of how CPTED and second generation CPTED and safe growth have evolved and progressed over the years. So instead of hacking away up here in the branches and trying to do things to communities and for communities, we move towards digging at the roots and doing it by the communities themselves, which is a large degree of what the safe growth program is all about. I'm just going to skip through. That's me. Before I get into my presentation, I want to introduce the brand new Canadian chapter called CPTED PCAM. Everybody wants me to pronounce it, although I do have a French last name. My French is rather limited, but we thought it was, we thought it was very important in terms of our diverse nation to include the prévention du crime par le management du milieu. How's that for a go? As a part of our title. The ICA Canadian chapter, thanks Greg, was just recently founded this year. There is an executive board of directors that formed that is continuing to develop programs, develop ways that we can start to educate and support Canadian CPTED practitioners and communities and other different stakeholders in a very diverse and inclusive way in Canada. So as we get this developed, I'm sure we'll hopefully be able to spread the word and get all of our Canadian crime prevention specialists to join on. I've had the pleasure of practicing CPTED for the past 20 years. I defended my thesis 20 years ago in October. And as a professional planner, I've had the privilege of working across a variety of different fields, looking at how to incorporate CPTED into our planning processes. I learned about CPTED in one of my planning classes and happened to be working for the police as I went through grad school and was trained in CPTED by them. As I sort of started to learn about it, it felt like something was missing. So that's where I came across second generation CPTED and have basically incorporated both first and second generation CPTED in a variety of different areas of planning that I've done, including master planning, strategic planning. I spent a long time doing architectural and functional programming. Typically, CPTED is not really even thought about until the development permit, like until something's being built. So we now at least have design guidelines, but my goal is still wherever we are to incorporate those principles into what we're doing, thinking about both the physical and the social as ways to frame how we develop and build out our communities. And now with safe growth, because we're often dealing with communities that haven't had CPTED applied to them early enough, or different issues raise up, we're working with communities to help them solve their own problems, both looking at building on the physical design elements as well as the social elements. So second generation CPTED really creates a context and builds the relationships within the community. You'll often see CPTED, or I, in many instances, see CPTED applied, put in some lights, trim up the tree canopy, cut the bushes. I've spoken with lots of different architects and landscape architects who kind of twitch a little bit if I mention CPTED, because just applying first generation CPTED has often been done in a way that sterilizes environments or tries to secure them. When we bring second generation CPTED into the equation, we're now creating a context. What types of design elements make sense based on the social parts of building the community fit for that community. So we're always trying to build the internal relationships, the cohesion within the community, the capacity for the community to respond and be resilient and have a mix of uses, and maintain that threshold of balance. Connectivity, so they're not behaving in a vacuum. They have lots of access to outside resources, other communities, different stakeholders, and then identifying the unique culture of a community. So not an ethnic culture, but how that community sees itself and how it defines itself. Before I go into the case study, which I'll go through very quickly, I just finished doing, the Alberta government just released some funding for different churches, community centers, friendship centers, different not-for-profit organizations that were experiencing an increase in hate crimes. And I was fortunate enough to get 3 different projects, 2 of them in Calgary and 1 of them in Fort McMurray. The government was only looking at traditional CPTED. So one of the churches really just wanted to, get some new lighting, increase their cameras and surveillance, and, basically target harden their organization. The other 2 churches were here in Calgary, in downtown Calgary, and we ended up being able to take them through an actual safe growth program and introduce them to second generation CPTED alongside what the government would fund. So the government was willing to fund both in assessment as well as implementation. So we taught the residents, or not the residents, the different parishioners and stakeholders within the church how to identify the issues as they came up, what was appropriate, as well as building the social programs. So in the downtown area, the one church who had experienced quite a bit of hate graffiti loved this idea that they didn't want to target hard in their area. They didn't want to exclude people. They wanted to work with the community and build a way, I think, towards reconciliation, so to speak, with our different populations. So it really resonates with communities when you start to empower them and give them the tools, which we do in Safe Growth. We go in with our 5-step program where the community starts with their own vision. Who do they want to be? How do they see themselves and where do they want to go? We teach them how to identify their problems, how to analyze them. So we teach them CPTED and different tactics, how to look at crime stats, how to do safety audits. Then they create the strategies. And we do all these trainings with both police and designers and social workers, whoever the stakeholders might be in terms of supporting that community. So they're really working with the community to get to where they want to together and building the relationships. I'm going to talk to you about a case study that was done, San Romanoway Apartments in a northern suburb in Toronto. San Romanoway is in the Jane Finch corridor, which has 60 high-rise buildings with over 50,000 inhabitants. It's been called probably Canada's example of failed social housing back in the 60s. The San Romanoway consists of 3 modern apartment-sized buildings, which you can see in the picture. There are 892 units and more than 4,000 residents. This area was seeing 122% crime rate above the national average. So lots of the typical issues in gangs, drugs, shootings, violence, fear. We went into the area working in there between 2000 and 2009. We worked with the community to create a neighborhood profile. We did CPTED, both basic and advanced first generation, as well as second generation. We did surveys. We got an understanding as to what the different issues were within the community, as well as what the community wanted. So as typical with apartment buildings that were designed like this back then, there's very little of transition of space or semi-private places for community members to socialize and get together. They had, the typical basketball court. One of the, of course, the thing is, well, let's build a basketball court. At the time, the Williams sisters were moving up the ranks in tennis, and so tennis was big in these communities, and the young girls were like, we don't want basketball. What are you talking? We want to play tennis. So that had a shift in terms of what was built in the community. There was, like I said, lots of places where there were gangs, tons of fear, the typical poor landscaping, poor lighting. All of these issues were addressed using second generation CPTED as well as traditional CPTED. And we had some amazing results as I see the time ticking by. Some of the programs that were incorporated into this area, social programs were created. A Youth Against Violence program was created. You can see the little corner of the youth in charge, rules, consequences. A computer room was created. Community gardens were put in, an entranceway sort of designating the area, a playground was put in with the help of 300 businesses around the community. And of course, Tennis Canada was happy to join in, providing tennis lessons and tennis programs in the community, as well as a visit from Serena Williams herself on the opening of the courts. So following this project, there were incredible results. So violent crime dropped from 35 to 49%, property crimes dropped from 13 to 20, fear dropped from 20 to 30, and participation in neighborhoods raised 17 to 32%. So of course, there's still, there are still issues in the community, but the community is better able to deal with them. And that's what we hope to build with Safe Growth, and how this program is impacting different communities that we're bringing it to.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you.
I appreciated the fact that what you showed the tree model, where that Greg was talking about, setting it up where you can dig at the roots, or you can hack at the leaves, and I think it's I like that model because the tree is a living being as well as our communities, and and that's basically what we're trying to address here is can we deal with those social issues through crime prevention, through environmental design, and or safe growth. So thank you very much for that. And with that, we'll move on to our last presenter, Steve Woolrich. Steve is passionate about creating safe and healthy built environments, and has always considered himself a boots on the ground consultant. His background is diverse and includes corporate security and asset protection. He leads Rethink Urban, which is a full spectrum community safety and well-being group that's fusing best practices, including CPTED, placemaking, healthy built environments to address complex community safety issues. Steve's dream is that community safety and well-being is embraced by both urban and rural communities across Canada, and has recently been elected as the Vice President of CPTED Canada. And with that, Steve, welcome. It's really good to see you again, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It's great to see everybody. I mean, fantastic that we're all reconnecting. I mean, I've worked with Greg in the past, and yourself, of course, and Anna. I'll talk a little bit about that here probably in a few minutes. I'm coming to you from the West Coast on Galliano Island, where I'm living off grid. So I had some issues on Monday. So if for some reason I drop off, I'll apologize now. But yeah, it's I guess when I think back, I mean, as all of you know, I was, worked with the ICA for several years. I'm trained in safe growth as well. I mean, I have the utmost respect for the safe growth group. In fact, there's aspects of that I still use in my own work. And I guess the interesting thing about it is when you said, fusing best practices, there are just so many best practices now that complement CPTED, which is basically what we developed, was this full spectrum approach. So I guess, I mean, you've covered background and I don't want to dwell on that, but I had the privilege in 1999 of being trained by Tim Crow. And then in 2000, trained by Tom McKay. And then I took a whole bunch of other courses over the years, both in Canada and in the States. So it's interesting. I mean, Greg said, earlier, he was speaking to the fact that CPTED just continues to evolve. And I think that's what's so exciting about it. And on the flip side, there's also some concerns as well that I'll get into, when I start my presentation here, which I should probably do. So I'll start screen sharing. So here's the overview. Just want to talk a little bit about roles and work undertaken, which I've kind of done already. I mean, I've had the privilege of working kind of across the country as well. Did some work in Ottawa a couple of years ago with the government over that way. Of course, now I'm on the West Coast, did a ton of work, as you all know, in the central Alberta area, well, throughout Alberta, really. I want to talk a little bit about, obviously, the social challenges that we face and how CPTED can certainly address some of those, and then opportunities for collaboration and learning. Because, you know, I'm kind of wearing two hats today, to be honest. Well, I'm actually wearing a toque, but you know, I'm the principal of Rethink Urban, but I'm also the vice president of CPTED Canada, which is very exciting for a number of reasons that I'll get into. But let's just carry on here. This is actually a slide I love using in presentations, and just full disclosure, this is a split screen that you're seeing here. Fact is, connection is huge, which is part of our tagline, people, place, connection. And then as you see on the left there, I think we all want to live on Pleasant Street. I mean, there's just so many issues in cities across the country now, and, you know, throughout the world. And I think ideally CPTED plays such a huge role in trying to get us to this point where we reduce crime, there's less fear of crime, and of course we improve our quality of life. So the social challenges that we're facing are, I mean, let's face it, it's really a challenging, it's super challenging right now. In all the work that we're doing, this is what we see: crime and social disorder, homelessness, mental health and addictions, all the trauma that Greg spoke to, which was kind of exciting. You know, earlier when he brought up third generation, right? I'm excited to hear more about that and learn about that. If it's going to address trauma, that's fantastic. So one of the things that I'll throw it up in the chat, but this slide shows a story unfolds. So this was a 6-month project that we completed in 2021 in Victoria, BC. Now, for anybody that's familiar with that city, and I know some of you have been there, I know Anne has been there for sure, because we met when she was here. And there's just some really challenging areas. This one in particular is Pandora Avenue, and it's in the neighborhood of North Park. So one of the things I recognized a long time ago was that often with CPTED, we have a tendency of parachuting in, as we like to call it. And we think, we think we're going to solve all these issues in a training or two, or boots on the ground for a couple of weeks. And it's simply, in my experience anyway, it's simply not the case. So what we did was we created what we call a community safety practitioner in residence. I'll admit I stole the idea from artist friends of mine who do artist residencies. And this one in particular was a 6-month residency, which actually got extended. We were doing this work for almost 8 months. So if you go, in case I can't get the link or something into the chat, if you go to the Rethink Urban website, so that's just rethinkurban.com, there's a blog called A Story Unfolds, and it kind of gives you the whole backdrop of the project. And then the link takes you to the story map. Now, this is an interesting thing in itself, and this is one of the things that our collaborative team at Rethink Urban has decided to use, is that this story map, you can go as shallow or as deep as you want into this story map. It would literally probably take you a day to get through it, because it provides all the data and everything we did as part of that project. So A Story Unfolds, and the link's available on the blog. Exciting work. I mean, I can't tell you how we're in a time right now where I think everybody's alluded to it so far, is that CPTED is just booming. And these supporting best practices, I call it these intersecting pathways. But the key, of course, really is collaboration, right? So, I mean, we think, okay, we've got CPTED Canada, which was just created. It was the planning for CPTED Canada. I'll give you a little background on that. The roots are solid. The roots were Tom McKay out east and CPTED Ontario. So when I got speaking with that board about potentially creating a national organization, it didn't take much convincing. So there's already a really strong membership with CPTED Canada, and also obviously with the ICA. And then we've got other groups that are starting to pop up, which is exciting too. I think there's an Alberta chapter that's tied in through the ICA as well. So I think that's going to be interesting for everybody just to really collaborate. Groups and services, I mean, ACPA, which stands for the Alberta Crime Prevention Association, we've done work with them. I wanted to throw a plug in for GVPN, stands for Greater Victoria Placemaking Network. Local police departments continue to do good work in CPTED, although very limited, usually based on capacity and expertise. And then practitioners and networks. We're so fortunate in Canada to have a lot of practitioners and networks like Safer Cities. I encourage you also to reach out to health networks as well. There's a great one in BC that's doing fantastic work around healthy built environments. So collaboration is key. I got on the slide there. It's time to rethink this. It's certainly not about competition. It's about working together. So I wanted to mention some noteworthy cities because I think we all know there's some great work being done out there. So I wanted to mention City of Kelowna. We were in Kelowna just in the last couple of years. We did what we call our full spectrum community safety and well-being course. Certainly there's a CPTED component to that, but as I spoke to earlier, the full spectrum approach is fusing other best practices. So we generally let facilitators who are experts in that field either Zoom in or be there in person. So we had Dr. Teal Phelps Banderoff did a session on placemaking. And we had Pam Moore leading the Healthy Built Environment component. We were there 5 days. And of course, what came out of that was their CPTED or community safety cohort, which is made up of the 40 people from different departments. And I think this is the way to do it. Municipalities should be looking at this kind of approach. Darren Call is leading the charge there. In fact, I think Darren's on the call, which is just so exciting to see that. So watch Kelowna. Next city up, Chilliwack. There was a council resolution there, I think it was in 2019, to adopt CPTED principles into the planning practice, which I've always encouraged, and I know you do as well, Elisabeth, Anna, Greg, we all do it. Whether it's done or not is another question. And the other thing is whether it's done well. And so I think Chilliwack will be a city to watch. The concerns, I guess, at this point, that I have about Chilliwack is that, there's some limitations around people there with practical experience. So if you look up the documentation as far as the resolution, it speaks to the fact that they want somebody with level 1 experience or a level 1 course. Well, in my experience, there's tons and tons of people out there with a level 1 course, but do they have practical experience? And then the second thing is it's really in some cases limited to local practitioners. And I think we all know that, if you're local, you don't always see the big picture, which is the beauty of having other practitioners collaborating and coming in to do this work. So it's a small community. So if you only had 1 or 2 practitioners, the scope of what you're going to see there is somewhat limited. I had to throw in the city of Red Deer because I lived there for 12 years. We did a lot of work in Red Deer. In fact, I wrote for Greg in the book that was mentioned earlier, the Safe Growth book. I wrote chapter 8 for that book, which was all about the work that was done in Red Deer. And then, of course, we've heard about cities Calgary and Edmonton are doing good work. And not to leave you to the last there, Elisabeth, but city of Saskatoon, I've always used that kind of as a benchmark. And you know that I've recommended that people reach out to you and such. So you've done some incredible work there. I want to just point out the fact that, I mean, Dan Gardner, great book, by the way, Risk, Science of Politics and Fear. We're actually still living in a very safe country. I know Greg's worked in a lot of places. So have I. I was in Dominican Republic in 2012, doing some CPTED work there and gang reduction work. We certainly see other cities and other countries that are in much worse shape than we here in Canada. We're very fortunate. And then something I always like to talk about is return on investment, because CPTED and some of these best practices, there's no question that there's return on investment. I've been brought into projects after the fact where no CPTED work had been done, and you're doing retrofits and all kinds of things that are costly. So I really think there's something to be said for getting into these things at the earliest stages, at the blueprint stage, before these built environments are built. And, you know, I think I'm going to more or less leave it at that. I want to make sure we've got a lot of time for discussions and questions. So I'll stop sharing the screen and we'll just get back at her.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate all you said. A really interesting point that you made, which is opposite sort of to ones I typically hear, in that often people sort of talk about, well, they've parachuted a consultant in from, usually it's Toronto. And what does that person know about my community? So I thought that was quite interesting, and almost like you need both the local experience, particularly I think the in some of the communities that you go into, it's actually even more important. Like I'm thinking of some of the communities that some of our members have gone into in really in South America, for example, where without the local knowledge, you wouldn't last 10 minutes. So maybe we need both somebody with the local knowledge and somebody who can see the big picture. So I appreciated you bringing out that that point, which was a little bit different than what I've heard along the way. And I'm really appreciative. Thank you, Oishi. Thank you to all the speakers, to Steve, to Anna, and to Greg, who is back at work already, for the time and effort you put in. It's always great to be on a session with my work friends and friends. And also to the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention for allowing us to do this presentation, because I think it's one thing that a lot of our municipalities and our rural groups could make use of, when in fact often CPTED it's seen as that first generation and kind of poo-pooed. It's like, oh yeah, well, we want something that's a little more deep, and we can be as deep as you want us to be. Because we know, as a planner, it's the second generation stuff that captured me in the beginning, because that spoke to my heart. That was about the people. It was about where they lived and how they lived, and you know, could they exist? Did they feel safe in their homes? Did they feel safe letting their kids walk to the to school? Could they ride their bike to school and their bike would be there after recess? Could I come home from work and my barbecue is still sitting in my backyard? It hasn't disappeared by the time I was gone. So all of those things to make our communities better and sustainable in the long run. So thank you all for being here and coming to the session. And Oishi, thank you for keeping us going and making sure we're doing it properly.